All right, welcome to today's webinar on the COP23 International Climate Negotiations hosted by Fresh Energy. My name is Dylan Sievers and I'll be moderating today's webinar. In the webinar today we'll be outlining what the world needs to see happen at the COP23 Climate Negotiations. Citizen can help. Speaking today is J. Drake Hamilton, Fresh Energy's Science Policy Director. Jay is a leading expert on climate policy at both the state and national levels, and her responsibilities include scientific analysis and policy development of clean energy solutions to global warming that will maximize economic opportunities. She represented Fresh Energy at the 2015 Paris Climate Summit and will be on the ground in Bonn, Germany, again this November during the climate conference, talking to diplomats, businesses, and people from across the world, providing insights into the Heartland's commitment to climate actions. Also speaking today is Patrick Hamilton from the Science Museum of Minnesota. Patrick is the Director of Global Change Initiatives at the Science Museum, where he develops projects that explore the challenges and opportunities of humanity as the dominant agent of global change. Patrick also is a board member of District Energy St. Paul, a principal investigator with the University of Minnesota's Urban Heat Island Network, and a fellow of the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment. Patrick will be attending the climate conference with a great Minnesota climate solution story, how the Science Museum of Minnesota cut heating load 75% with a 3-year payback. So with that, we'll start the webinar beginning with J. Drake Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Dylan, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'm with Fresh Energy, and we are Minnesota's only climate and energy policy nonprofit that's independent. And we've existed now for 25 years, thanks to our members. And that means we have a 25-year track record, I'm very proud to say, of policy successes. So we can take a look back and see whether the policies we've advanced have worked. Every single year since our existence, we've helped pass one or more major state or national policies that move us forward on clean energy. And Fresh Energy approaches our work, and one of the things that drew me to Fresh Energy is that we are a science-based, data-driven organization. Our goals include making sure that Minnesotans have affordable and reliable energy, but also that we maximize clean water and clean air goals and make deep cuts in carbon dioxide. We're very interested in making sure that policies establish a level playing field and grow markets in energy efficiency, in wind energy, and in solar energy. When we look at policy leadership and we look to Minnesota, we have identified, and you'll hear stories today, of some of the nation-leading growth in renewable energy that's happening right here in the heartland in Minnesota. Some of the nation-leading decarbonization that's happening with our biggest utility company, Xcel Energy, as well as some information about corporate policies coming out of Minnesota that are also driving deep carbon reductions going forward. And I'm going to go back. One of the reasons why Minnesotans like Patrick and myself are going to the annual climate negotiations is to show the world what real climate action looks like in a heartland state. And the reason we think that Minnesota is important is that unlike some coastal states, we have weather here. We have cold winters, we have hot summers. We also have historically had a very high dependence on coal and other fossil fuel use. We're a state with heavy industry and agriculture, and so we have been a historically very energy-intensive state. So we have had to dig ourselves out of a pretty deep carbon and climate hole. And we've started to do that. And so we are going to Bonn to tell the stories of the clean energy economy that is already employing 57,000 Minnesotans at wages 42% higher than the statewide average. We want to shine a light on what we think is the clean energy revolution that is already underway, that's growing good jobs in both rural and urban Minnesota without raising energy bills. I want to start with our signature policy in Minnesota that was strongly bipartisan and was signed into law by Governor Tim Pawlenty. Take a look at the Renewable Energy Standard. On the third bullet, the energy saving standards that apply to all of our utilities, and then focus in on the middle part of the policy, which are science-based climate goals that apply across our economy. These are the levels of reductions that scientists tell us are necessary if we're going to keep climate change away from chaotic and disastrous levels. So Minnesota set out on this path about 10 years ago, and that also means we can look back on 10 years of track record to see how we're doing. And here is one way to take a look at that in the power sector. These two pie charts look at 2 points in time, 2004 on the left and 2016 on the right. So bear in mind this is about half a generation, or only half a generation in time, looking at the renewable energy standard and how it has helped diversify Minnesota's economy. First, take a look at the black wedge, which is coal. And we've gone from about a 65% reliance on coal to less than 40% reliance on coal today, just 12 years later. Isn't that remarkable? What has picked up the difference and kept the lights on affordably is renewable energy, especially wind farms in Minnesota and in surrounding states. And those are depicted as the green wedge, which has grown from 5% of our electricity now to 22, 23% of our electricity. I've very rarely seen an issue in environmental and energy policy where you see that direct correlation. As we've dialed back the use of coal, and our utilities have, they have ramped up very affordably the use of wind and other types of renewable energy. And so that has given us, this folks, is the start of decarbonization in the power sector, with much more to come. And this is a primary example why Minnesota, in the tougher heartland state, one of the tougher heartland states, is making very deep progress on carbon, and started in the 2004-2005 timeframe. The other thing that's been helpful to us in moving forward is that the costs of renewable energy have come down very rapidly. So sometimes we say it's like the wind has shifted and is now a little bit at our backs as we try to address this climate change problem. So for instance, here is a quote from the head of Xcel Energy in Minnesota. Xcel provides about half the power to Minnesota. It's our biggest utility. They also operate in 7 other states. So they're the 4th biggest utility in the country. And they are finding now that new wind farms are costing them less than their lowest cost coal plant. In fact, if you dig deeper, you find the wind farms are costing them less than just buying the coal from Wyoming and shipping it here, or buying the uranium fuel for nuclear power plants. So that's a remarkable change, and the market is helping us move forward. The other thing that's helped us move forward, and what we'll be talking about in Bonn, is Xcel's business decision to replace 2 of its largest coal plants a couple of years ago. They'll be doing that in the 2023 and 2026 timeframe. And they're doing it because of analysis that was done by Fresh Energy and our partners, which demonstrated it was actually cheaper for Xcel to retire these older coal plants and replace them with massive amounts of clean energy. Xcel agreed with us, and regulators approved that. And we calculated that that decision would produce a benefit by 2030 of a 60% CO2, 60% carbon dioxide reduction for Xcel Energy customers. But the story gets better. Just 10 days ago, Xcel was back talking to regulators in Minnesota with an update on that story. They were announcing that they are going to meet their 60% carbon reduction goal not by 2030, but 8 years earlier in 2022. And in fact, their CEO, Ben Folk, announced a new vision for 2030, that the utility in Minnesota will get to 60% renewables, and that will make it an 85% carbon-free utility. These numbers are roughly 2 to 3 times the Paris Agreement goals that I'm going to talk about next. But I wanted to start by setting the stage for you on how far Minnesota has come and the types of initiatives led by policy organizations like Fresh Energy, but supported by utilities in some cases, are moving us forward as a heartland state. Now, when we are in Bonn, we're going to be looking at a couple of treaties, and the most important one is is sometimes referred to as the Rio Earth Summit Treaty. Some of you may remember that. Officially, it's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You'll see it abbreviated as UNFCCC. And the United States, it is very important, the United States is a party to this treaty, and President Trump has not proposed removing the United States from this treaty. And take a look at the main goal: to prevent dangerous anthropogenic human-caused interference with the climate system. So 2 years ago, in Paris, the parties to this treaty, the 197 countries, came together, and they passed by consensus, unanimous consensus, the Paris Agreement. Fresh Energy happened to be there for 17 days working with people including Secretary John Kerry and Senator Franken. And the results of that treaty are that the world's nations agreed to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The United States brought forward, under then-President Obama, the national commitment that the U.S. would cut climate pollution between 26 and 28% by 2025. So that's called our Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. Now, we have seen with our new president that the United States appears poised to isolate itself from the many other countries of the world with regard to this treaty, that we will, as soon as the treaty allows, which would not be, by the way, until November of 2020, that the United States would leave the Paris Agreement. But this graphic provided by World Resources Institute does a good job of showing you how isolated the United States would be in that case. Take a look at that. We would be one of only 2 countries that is not moving forward to meet with the rest of the world and commit to the Paris Agreement. Take a look at that isolation there. But the great bulk of the rest of the countries are indeed continuing to move forward. Now, when we're in Bonn, we are going to be led by the president of what is called the COP. COP23 is the 23rd year of this. I'm going to call him Frank. I'm not exactly sure yet how to pronounce his last name, and I don't want to mislead you. But he's a very interesting man. He will be the president of the COP, and as you see in the COP is meeting in Germany. But Fiji is his country, and Fiji is the first small island developing state to assume the presidency of this annual meeting. It's a very important process because it encompasses the formal negotiations and the partnerships for the world to act going forward. This is made possible because Fiji does not have the infrastructure to support a big conference like this, and so Germany has stepped up and empowered Fiji to work through Germany. So that's why we'll be in Bonn. And Frank has said, I see myself as a team captain leading from the front, giving encouragement and persuasion where it's needed. My role in this proceeding is, of course, to be impartial, to act in the collective interest of all countries. But it's important, and I included this map here because he also specified, I certainly bring my own perspective to these negotiations. As a Pacific Islander who comes from a region that is bearing the brunt of climate change, rising seas, extreme weather events, changes to agriculture that threaten our way of life and in some cases our very existence, we know for sure that no one, no matter who they are or where they live, will ultimately escape the impacts of climate change. And so starting next week in Bonn, we need decisive action to address the underlying causes of climate change, fully respecting climate science. And so he made clear that this proceeding must be as ambitious as possible, and he has laid out for the world that he intends to uphold and advance the Paris Agreement, to ensure there is progress on the implementation guidelines for that agreement, and design the process for something called the facilitative dialogue, where the world will set the rules for meeting the agreement, and that will happen in November 2018. He intends to forge a grand coalition to accelerate climate action before 2020. And he wants to do that between civil society, the scientific community, the private sector, and all levels of government. And you'll see as I talk about Minnesota's participation, we actually have participation in Minnesota that will be on the program in Bonn with members of civil society, NGOs, government, business, and the scientific community. So I'm quite proud of that. By November 17th, which is the ending date of the conference, the world's nations need to essentially turn in their homework, including work on the details of the Paris Agreement. And here is what those details include. First, progress on transparency. That is, how will parties, the countries who are part of the treaty, how will they ensure the integrity of countries' mitigation actions? And that's, as you can imagine, quite important, because if the actions don't have integrity, if we can't ensure that those reductions are happening, we might as well not be at the table. So that's of primary importance. Second, the countries need to determine the future of the adaptation fund that will be used to help poor countries cope with the impacts of climate change and global warming. They will need to set up the time frames for delivering on those two commitments, and then they will need, I've mentioned this term, facilitative dialogue. That's the main action that will happen in November of 2018. They need specific plans that will gauge how countries are progressing toward meeting their Paris Agreement commitments. So there's a lot of work to be done. Fresh Energy is going to be reporting out daily in a blog, and if you'd like to be part of that and hear what's happening on a daily basis during the second week, the important diplomatic week of the conference that starts on November 11th, just shoot me an email. You'll see my address at the end, and I will make sure that you're included in that going forward so that you get those communications. Very shortly after the U.S. national election, a group of states, businesses, investors, and cities formed something called the United States Climate Alliance. And it was centered on states, you see the states, including Minnesota here, who helped form this Climate Alliance. And I'm quite proud that Minnesota is part of it. The members of the Alliance agreed to hold warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy that will benefit our security, our prosperity, and our health. And I outlined for you at the beginning of this webinar what some of the signature points of those benefits have been for Minnesota going forward. So far, 13 governors, both Democratic and Republican, have formed this alliance, and 10 additional governors have published individual declarations in support of the Paris Agreement. Indeed, earlier this year at the yearly G20 summit, there was an unprecedented act of isolating a single country. Usually the G20 hangs together as the G20, but in fact in July, the remaining what they called the G19 states, not the U.S., reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Agreement and also clearly stated that it was irreversible regardless of President Trump's attempted action. Also, at Fresh Energy, we think the U.S. action on climate change that we're already seeing, and it's emblematic what's happening here in Minnesota, is indeed that action is irreversible because of economic forces and health and environmental benefits of taking the Climate Alliance now represents approximately 40% of the U.S. population, so that's about 130 million Americans. A total so far of 1,780 businesses and investors have joined the Climate Alliance, including locally here, Target Corporation, headquartered in Minnesota. So Minnesota has made a strong commitment along with other states. It's a bipartisan coalition with businesses involved. I'm also very happy to say that Fresh Energy was approached by the We Are Still In coalition to have specifically a Minnesota-centered event talking about deep climate action and deep carbon cuts at a location called the U.S. Climate Action Pavilion in Bonn. And that event will happen on Wednesday, November 15th. We'll be sending out to all of you the date and time of that. And I think that will be happening at a time, a nice time in mid-morning here in Minnesota. We'll be looking to live stream that event back to Minnesota. And if that is not possible, we will surely tape it and make it accessible to all of you and people across Minnesota. So at that pavilion, we'll be showcasing cuts in carbon pollution that make Minnesota a leader. We'll have business, government, and NGO voices, including people from the state of Minnesota, the Science Museum of Minnesota, Patrick Hamilton, myself from Fresh Energy, and also representatives from Target Corporation. We'll be calling it U.S. Heartland Climate Action. And again, we'll be talking about how at Minnesota we're hoping to accelerate the clean energy revolution, achieving carbon reductions 2 to 3 times the goals in the Paris Agreement. This is what in UN speak is sometimes called high ambition. And as you follow the proceedings that are happening in Europe, we hope that you'll consider a couple of important ways that you can help. First of all, these stories that I've told you today and that we'll be telling in Bonn, not every Minnesotan knows these, and not every media outlet around the country who will be covering the negotiations knows that the Heartland is taking very significant action. We urge you to help us amplify these stories of Minnesota achievement, perhaps to write an op-ed, write an LTE, a letter to the editor, and certainly make sure your own business and your power company that supplies power to your business, make sure that like Xcel Energy, they're doing their part. And then remember those Xcel Energy goals for 2030, we need to make sure that they're actually implemented and done well, and you can help with that going forward as well. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Patrick Hamilton, who's going to run through for you what I think is the deepest carbon reduction example happening right now in Minnesota.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar today. I want to start out, first of all, with this image. It's me in front of a building at the Mauna Loa Observatory, which is operated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, way up on the cold, dry slopes of Mauna Loa on the Big Island of Hawaii. It was in this building back in 1958 when Dr. Charles Keeling made the first accurate measurements of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And from those calculations, it was determined that humans were, in fact, increasing the concentration of this greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, which is why nearly 6 decades later, thousands of people from around the world will be converging in Bonn to deal with human-caused climate change. And I am proud that the Science Museum of Minnesota will be represented at the COP23 conference because we have several important messages to convey. The first climate energy message is about energy efficiency. And I'll be telling the story about the fact that several years ago, the Science Museum implemented an aggressive energy efficiency retrofit of the Science Museum that resulted in us cutting the Science Museum's heating bills by 75% for a savings of nearly $300,000 a year and a simple payback of slightly over 3 years. Of course, we did this project in order to save energy, reduce our environmental impact, and also to save money. But there have been broader benefits. We helped employ the factory workers, truck drivers, riggers, concrete workers, electricians, pipe fitters, software technicians, and many other tradespeople who together retrofitted one building over the course of 18 months. Imagine the economic, employment, and environmental benefits if energy-efficient buildings in the U.S. weren't rare, but commonplace. Which brings me to the second climate energy message that the Science Museum will be communicating in Bonn, which is about energy, renewable energy. The Science Museum continues to invest in cost-effective energy efficiency, and we anticipate that by doing so, we will be steadily declining the use of electricity at the Science Museum and overall reducing our annual electrical consumption of electricity. But the Science Museum will always continue to be buying large quantities of electricity to power the Science Museum. So back in the spring of 2017, the president of the Science Museum of Minnesota, Allison Brown, signed contracts to get electricity from a community solar garden anticipated to be constructed in central Dakota County. And that community solar garden is now operational. And so now the Science Museum is powered in part with clean, renewable solar energy. And we are anticipating that starting next year, that'll be providing 26% of the Science Museum's electricity at a savings of $14,000 a year due to the enormous drops in the cost of both wind and solar energy in recent years. But as the Science Museum continues to invest in energy efficiency, the share of our electricity that comes from solar will climb steadily as the years go by. Which brings me to climate and energy message number 3, which is that the Science Museum of Minnesota is a scientific research and educational institution. We agree with the overwhelming scientific consensus that human-caused climate change is real. And this is the statement on global climate change that is on the Science Museum's website and has been there for many years now. I look forward to being in Bonn and working on climate mitigation, but more importantly, I look forward to continuing that work back in Minnesota. This is a save the date for all you folks. On April 20th of 2018, the Science Museum of Minnesota will be hosting a conference, Code Blue for Patient Earth. The first conference in Minnesota devoted exclusively to exploring the public health implications of climate change. And with that, I just want to say that the Science Museum of Minnesota feels very strongly that climate change is a real and important issue that is facing not only current but future generations, but that there are enormous economic employment opportunities for addressing this issue. And together, I look forward to working with all of you to achieve more, better, and faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay and Patrick, for those excellent presentations. There certainly is a lot more happening in the Midwest that the world needs to know about than most realize. We've left some time for Q&A for about 10 or 15 minutes or so, and I just want to remind everyone that you can ask any questions you have in the chat box on your left. If we don't get to your questions, we will follow up with you via email. All right, we'll start out. I have a couple questions for Patrick. I have one in here. Did the Science Museum have any help in doing its energy retrofit project?
Yeah, we had a very willing and helpful partners. Wells Fargo, Ecolab, and Target were very important financial backers to this project. The St. Paul Port Authority provided a very important low-interest loan. And District Energy St. Paul was very helpful in helping us figure out how to interface our new energy efficiency system with their district heating and cooling system.
That's a really exciting project. Could you maybe explain a little bit more how you cut your heating bills by 75% in this cold climate of Minnesota?
Sure. The Science Museum, like all large buildings, uses enormous amounts of electricity. Electricity inevitably degrades into heat anywhere and everywhere where we use it. But in large buildings like the Science Museum, we have to manage that heat, otherwise the interiors of the building would quickly overheat. Now, traditional ways of managing that heat, like in the Science Museum, has just been simply to expel that heat from the building as quickly and easily as possible. But what we did is we installed a couple of machines called heat recovery chillers that allow us to not throw the heat energy away, but capture that heat energy from portions of the building where it's in excess, where we do not want it, and transfer it to other areas of the building where we do need that heat energy.
That's very innovative. Next, it looks like we have a question for Jay. This is probably the million-dollar question. What does Minnesota and the world stand to lose if President Trump continues to undermine global action?
Yes, obviously it's very disturbing to the many, many Minnesota and U.S. citizens who are deeply concerned about the need for climate action. So in part we did this webinar to begin to actively dispel the mistaken assumption that without the U.S., no effective climate protection is possible. So you'll notice that I started with the Minnesota story. And what undergirds that is the fact that most energy and climate decisions are not made at the federal government level, but they're made at the state level. So many states, including Minnesota, are continuing to move forward because that's where the right decisions are being made, and they're being bolstered by many power companies around the country, most power companies who are clear they're not going to be building any new coal plants because it's not cost effective to do that, and they're moving forward very rapidly with the much cheaper, cleaner sources of energy. The United States, under the Trump administration, has indicated that it will continue to engage in the 1992 Framework Convention process. That's the underlying treaty, the Rio Treaty, and that's why I started early in this webinar with that treaty, including that they will continue to engage in Paris-related negotiations. The nature of the exact engagement that we'll see in Bonn by the U.S. so far is unclear. We haven't heard. We understand that they will have our country will have diplomats there, but we don't know exactly what their intentions will be. So we'll be watching them closely and reporting back to you here in the United States. The Trump administration has said it will actively participate in negotiations up until it is expected to withdraw from the Paris Agreement in November of 2020. In fact, the first date they can do that is, I believe, Election Day or the day after elections in 2020. So that's pretty interesting. But the U.S., more troubling, is the U.S. is no longer bringing funds to the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund or other mechanisms that the world's countries together use to help poor countries respond to global warming. And the world's largest economy essentially at the national level has abandoned its commitment to limit greenhouse gas emissions. So very troubling indeed, and that's part of the reason why we're going to the negotiations. When the world's largest historic greenhouse gas emitter signals a departure from the deal unless what they have not specified as conditions for re-engagement are met, the rest of the world has to show it is still committed at this year's Conference of the Parties. So although a number of what the UN calls subnational actors, that means states or cities or regions, so Minnesota is a subnational actor, are doing a lot to cut carbon and are committed to doing much more and accelerating that. Those subnational groups, including Minnesota, are not actively part of the negotiations. And so we need to make sure that the rest of the world's countries see that it is not just what's happening in Washington, D.C., but what's happening across our great country that they should also take heart from going forward.
Oh, thank you, Jay. Next question, what is the best way to follow all of the proceedings in Bonn besides maybe the Fresh Energy blog? Are there other media outlets?
Yeah. And we believe all the major media outlets will be covering it. Usually they focus their coverage during it's a 2-week set of negotiations. Usually you see the press come in, especially for the second week of the negotiations, because that's when the world's diplomats are there. And they'll really be heightening their coverage in the last day or two. So that would be November 15th, 16th, and 17th that you should be looking for coverage. But because this is such an important indicator of where the Trump administration is and where businesses in America are and where really important states, not just Minnesota, but New York and Virginia and California, Colorado, what they are thinking, which is often, it seems, at odds with the direction that the Trump administration is setting. I think that there's an interesting friction there that may mean that there would be more coverage going forward. There will be a lot of events. We hope to get some coverage from our Minnesota event, and we'll certainly be pushing that out. We have set up a link on our homepage where you can get the latest information, including a copy of this webinar.
Great, thanks, Jay. I have one other question for right now, and just want to remind anyone else, if you have any questions, feel free to ask away. Jay, could you step us through some of the things that Minnesotans can do to help during Bonn?
Thank you so much. And what we have found is the biggest impediment to more people being energized about climate action is that people don't know some of these stories that Patrick and I have been telling you, don't know that we're not starting from square one. We're actually moving forward on decarbonization. We're in a clean energy economy that's advancing rapidly now. Some people have called it a clean energy revolution. It's being driven by lower prices. It's being driven by large corporations. Target Corporation, for instance, last week announced that they're going to try to source 100% of their electricity for their U.S. operations from renewable energy, working with partners going forward. It is those big increments of clean energy development and carbon reduction that are really exciting. So I encourage you, as you think about action on climate change, to think about really deep carbon reductions, because time is of the essence. And we can help you tell those stories. You can come back and take a look at some of these slides. We can help you with letters to the editor and writing op-ed pieces. We encourage you, especially if your favorite media outlet is not covering the Minnesota stories. And if the Minnesota outlet, make sure they know these stories and refer them to us for more information. Because I think sometimes what happens is people think that any international negotiations are talking heads happening in a remote location and have no bearing on their lives. This is really, and the quality of life for kids growing up today So we encourage you to bring it back to the level and use these very positive, I think inspiring examples of what institutions like the Science Museum of Minnesota and the biggest utility in Minnesota are doing, because it's the cost-effective thing to do. Those are leadership positions, and we hope that you'll help amplify those.
Great, and maybe with that, I'll let you promote this next webinar that we have coming up in ways to stay engaged. For all those interested, on Tuesday, November 28th, Fresh Energy will have a follow-up webinar on the highlights from COP23 and what happened, and then the next steps for Minnesota. Jay, do you want to speak for a moment about this?
Yeah, of course, we're talking a few days before these negotiations begin, and we don't know exactly what will happen, so that's the exciting thing. But we'll be reporting back right afterwards, a couple weeks from today, and give you the highlights of what happened, and then what also we think needs to happen next in Minnesota to support that. Because it's not just about somebody else making decisions for us, not at all. It's really a ground-up effort based on grassroots action, business action, local institutions' actions, and bringing them up to the level that we really need to fight this problem. So you'll hear more about that on November 28th.
Oh, great. Well, I think that'll wrap up today's presentation. Thank you, Jay and Patrick, and all of you for watching today's webinar. This is excellent insights into the upcoming COP23 climate negotiations. Just want to remind everyone, please check back on Fresh Energy's website, Facebook, or Twitter page for updates from Jay while she's in Bonn. And remember to register for the Tuesday, November 28th webinar. Lastly, if you would also like to be included in a mailing list with live updates from Jay while she is in Bonn, you can email her at the contact information provided below. And with that, we hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day, and please, and stay engaged in the climate negotiations. And we look forward to talking more about this on Tuesday, November 28th.